the story behind what made a hero a hero. You know, for example, if we're talking about superheroes, and we've talked about heroes each week this summer, and you know that I love comics and I love superheroes, and for superheroes, there's a series of events and there's a series of choices that have made them who they are. So for example, Superman. Superman was put into a rocket ship as a little child, blasted off into space while his home planet explodes. So he's orphaned, and he crash lands on a planet in Kansas, and he's adopted by a family. And this family sees that he's unique, and they teach him to hide his uniqueness. And Superman grows up, and then he becomes this person who for the rest of his time is devoted to making sure that what happened to his home planet of Krypton, what happened to his parents, never happens to his adopted planet. Or take Batman, for example. Batman, also orphaned by his parents, but very different. You know, he saw his parents be killed by people that were mugging him in an alley. And so Batman, or Bruce Wayne at that time, made a vow as a child that he would never let this happen to someone else, that he would have vengeance on crime, and that drove him forward for the rest of his story. Or take Bruce Banner. Bruce Banner is the Hulk. Bruce Banner is a little bit temperamental, he's a little bit high-strung, let's say, and he gets exposed to gamma radiation, which when he gets mad, he turns green, literally, and he gets big and he starts destroying things. These are their origin stories. And every hero has an origin story. Every hero has a series of events, a series of choices that defines who they are and who they become. And we have origin stories too, don't we? If you think back in your life, you have events in your life, some of them good and some of them bad, that make you who you are. You have choices that you have made in your lifetime that make you who you are. We all have an origin story. And today we're going to look at the origin story of a guy by the name of Daniel. And Daniel had everything going for him until something traumatic happened in his life, something that life-changing, something that would have driven him in a certain direction. But Daniel made some choices. And I think if we will pay attention to the choices that Daniel made, 3 choices in particular, in his origin story, if we pay attention to those choices, that we can make a difference in our life too. Because sometimes in our origin story, we have scripts that are written, things that we've chosen in the past, and now today we make choices and we don't even know why we do them anymore. We get frustrated unexplainably. We do this or we do that, and it's all because of events or choices in our past, and sometimes those can be limiting to us. Sometimes we don't even like those choices or the way that we respond to things today. And if we will pay attention to what Daniel did, and to the choices he made, we can change those behaviors that we don't like. And we can find our way through troubled times just like Daniel did, because even though things may be going great today, you know, right? That someday, at some point, things are going to hit a bump in the road. And then you're going to have to react. And Daniel teaches us how to change the scripts that play in our life, but also how to deal with the tough times in our life that maybe you're going through right now. And so let's dig in and let's look at our hero this week, a guy by the name of Daniel. You'll find it in your brown Bibles in the book of Daniel. He's got a whole book written after him. So on page 667 of the brown Bibles, I'd love it if you'd follow along with me as we read Daniel's origin story. And what we're going to find is that the choices today determine what tomorrow will be like. And this is what we see in Daniel's origin story. Now, as we begin Daniel's story, here's what you need to know. Daniel was a real person. He wasn't like Superman or Batman. He actually existed. And he lived in the 500 and 600 BC time frame. And this was a turbulent time. This was a time of war. This was a time when nations and city-states were going to war against each other. And Daniel lived under the threat of violence all the time. Sounds a little bit like today, doesn't it? And let's begin reading at verse 1. It says, during the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, that's where Daniel lived, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar, he fancied himself to be the most powerful king there was. He called himself the King of Kings, meaning I am the best of all the kings that are out there. And King Nebuchadnezzar, you can Google him and you can see that he was a real-life person who ruled the Babylonian Empire. He ruled the earth, the then-known earth at that time. And he comes to Judah, and he lays siege on Judah. Verse 2, and the Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah, and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Now this was par for the course with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, he would lay siege to Jerusalem over a period of almost 2 decades. And during that time, each siege would get worse in Jerusalem, until finally Jerusalem is utterly destroyed. And what we're looking at in the story here at the time of Daniel is the first siege that takes place. And Nebuchadnezzar wins the day after this siege, and he goes in and he goes into the temple to the place, this is the house of God. Okay, that's what the Jews believed, is that God actually resided there, and he believed that Jerusalem was a special place to God. So the fact that Nebuchadnezzar would even set foot in Jerusalem, that he would conquer Jerusalem, this was devastating to a Jew. And for him to walk into the temple, or for his forces to walk into the temple and take away some of the sacred items, this was a catastrophe. And what was being said by Nebuchadnezzar doing this, and we don't get this because it's not a big deal, but what he's saying is that by taking these things back and putting them into his temple for his God, he's saying, not only have I defeated you, Jerusalem, but I have defeated your God. And your God is either dead or he's serving my God. And for a Jew, this was devastating, because they believed that if they lost the war, if they believed that if things like this happened, that God had abandoned them forever. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't just take sacred artifacts, sacred things from the temple. Verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. So not only does he take the sacred things that says, I am in charge of your God, I've defeated your God, he takes the nobles of the day, and he takes their children and he holds them hostage. And the threat was that if you rebel, Jerusalem, if you try to rise up against me, I will kill your children. And he did this wherever he went. He brings hostages back to Babylon. And eventually, actually, when he destroys Jerusalem, he takes everybody from Jerusalem back to Babylon, totally displaces them. But Daniel is one of the first ones to go in this first siege that happens. Verse 4, Nebuchadnezzar has a plan that's even greater than just holding Daniel hostage, though. It says, select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning. They're gifted with knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. And the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. So Nebuchadnezzar creates kind of an executive training school, or a royal finishing school, where he takes the people that he is holding captive and he takes the best of them. And he enrolls them in this school where he teaches them all about the Babylonian Empire, where he gives them the best of the best. And Daniel is one of them. It says in verse 6, it says Daniel and Hananiah, I was worried about this name, Mishael and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff, Ashpenaz, renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. Azariah was called Abednego. What Nebuchadnezzar is doing, besides giving me lots of hard names to say, what Nebuchadnezzar is doing is he has taken the best of the best from Jerusalem, and he's enrolled them into this royal finishing school. And he's given them the best foods. He's given them great education, and he's renamed them as well. And what he's trying to do is change their identity. They were Jews, and there were other people from other nations enrolled in this school as well, and they had their national identity, and Nebuchadnezzar is rewriting that identity. He takes them and he isolates them from the rest of their countrymen. So he takes Daniel from Jerusalem and pulls him into Babylon. But then he not only does that, because there's other Jews that Daniel is living with, and he takes Daniel and his 4 friends and probably some others, it's assumed that there was, that takes those other people and he pulls them into the castle to live, or into this royal finishing school. So they are completely isolated from everything that they know and everything that they believe. It's kind of like going away to university, right? If you ever went away to university, you know, you're away from family, you're away from your friends, you're away from everything that you grew up with. And suddenly you're put into this environment where, I can do whatever I want. And that's what happens with Daniel. But not only that, but he begins to teach him. He begins to teach him the finest literature, the history of Babylon. And what this is really royal propaganda. He's brainwashing him to believe that Babylon is better than anything else. And then he gives him the best food. He gives him any drink that he wants. He gives him the best life that he possibly could so that he doesn't ever want to go back to Jerusalem. Because remember Jerusalem was where you were under siege. And when you're under siege, you are starved. That's how they win a siege, is they cut off all the supplies so that you starve. And Daniel now is in the lap of luxury. Who would ever want to go back to Jerusalem? Because Babylon, after all, rules. And we're training you to be the best of the best. And the last part of what Nebuchadnezzar is to rename Daniel. You see, Daniel, a good Jewish boy, had a name that honored God. Even in his very name, he honored God. Daniel means, my judge is God. Hananiah means, my great God, Yahweh gave me grace. And these two guys and their other friends all received new names. And these new names are all reflective of a Babylonian god. And Nebuchadnezzar is trying to steal their identity of who they really are in this moment. And Daniel has a choice. How is he going to respond to all of this? And maybe you feel a little bit like Daniel today. Maybe you are going away to university and you're not sure what it's going to be like because everything that you know and you believe is here. Or maybe you go into a workplace every single day where people are against you, where they are against what you believe. Or maybe you're going to go to school in the fall, a new school, and you're nervous about that. And you're nervous about who you are and who you are going to be in this new place. And Daniel can teach us about the choice that we need to make. Because Daniel made a choice that's probably different than a lot of other people would make. Because everybody else in this program, besides Daniel and his friends, they were like, well, when in Babylon, do what the Babylonians do, right? Let's go along to get along. But Daniel made a different choice. Verse 8. But Daniel, remember, he's a teenager. He's not a grown adult. When we think of Daniel, we often think of Daniel in the lion's den. But this is the teenager Daniel, decades earlier. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now, what's with the food, okay? We talked a little bit about with the kids, but I didn't really get into the full thing. What is with the food? Yes, God had given the Jews dietary restrictions. He had said, you can eat this, you can eat that. That's where this word kosher comes from. It comes all from the dietary restrictions that God gives. But surely, the food that the king was serving was not all on the do not eat list, right? I mean, that would be a whole lot of food. So why is Daniel refusing not to eat the food? And the reason that he refuses not to eat that food, reason he refuses to eat that food, is because the food had likely been served to an idol beforehand, likely had been sacrificed to an idol. That's what happened in a king's palace, is the food would be sacrificed to an idol, and God prohibited his people from eating food that was sacrificed to an idol. This was not honoring to God. And Daniel had no way of knowing where that juicy steak had come from. He had no way of knowing where that wine had been used before that. And so he said, the only thing that I can have confidence in is vegetables and water. And so that's what he chose to eat. Because even with his food, he wanted to honor God. He determined not to defile himself, not to do anything that would compromise his faith. Verse 9, now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to other youths, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. And Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel and his friends. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we compare to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. And the attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. This is risky for Daniel to do. I mean, he's already been told no, but he pushes the point because he just wants to honor God with his food. He wants to do things, whatever he can do. I mean, he can't go to the temple anymore. He can't read the Torah because all those things are back in his home country and he is here. But what can he do? What one thing can he do to honor God? I can honor God with the food that I eat. And Daniel, this teenager who's far from home, far from mom and dad, far from the religious system that he grew up with, chooses to still honor God. This is significant because everything in Daniel's life would have said that God doesn't care for you. Your God was defeated by Nebuchadnezzar and his gods. Your God doesn't care for you because you were taken from Jerusalem, from the promised land, from the place where God lives. And you have been exiled to this country of Babylon. So God is done with you, Daniel. That is what the propaganda that would have been put before him day after day after day. And yet Daniel chooses not to believe it. He chooses instead to lean into relationship. To say, I don't believe that God is done with me. Yes, hard things are happening, but I choose to lean into relationship. And the way that I'm going to show this is through my food. The one thing I can control. I will lean into relationship by honoring God with the food that I eat. And this is the first choice that he does. Is he says, I'm going to honor God. I'm going to lean into relationship even when everything says and everyone around me says that God is not for me. And this is the same thing that we need to do when we hit hard times, is lean into relationship. Oftentimes, you know what we do? We lean out, don't we? We ask the question, why? We ask the question, God, how could you do this to me? And in a way, we are leaning out of that relationship because what really we're doing is we're not trusting that he is for us. We think he has gone against us. And we lean out at the time that we most need to lean into this relationship. Because God is still in control, even when things look out of control. That's the message of Daniel. It's the message that keeps coming back to time and time again. In verse 2, it starts off. How does it start off? If you look in your Bible, it says, the Lord gave Nebuchadnezzar the victory over Jerusalem. So Nebuchadnezzar, who thought he was the king of all kings, actually God is the king of all kings. And he gave Nebuchadnezzar the right to win over King Jehoiakim. See, God is sovereign even when it doesn't look like it. So lean in to that relationship. The problem is that sometimes we get into these situations, we lean out, or sometimes we get into a situation and it's kind of like everybody's thinking, well, you go to church on Sunday? Oh, you believe that sort of thing? And instead of, saying, yeah, we just kind of pretend like, well, no, I don't really believe that stuff. And we ignore him. It's kind of like a teenager in high school. When I went to high school, I had these two guy friends, Dave and Jeff, who I'd gone through grade school with. And we got to high school, and suddenly we had a new crowd of friends around us, right? And Jeff and I were having a great time. And this new crowd of friends, they kind of looked on Dave, and it was kind of like, he's kind of weird. And, I have to admit, Dave was kind of weird in grade school too, but he was my friend. He was my kind of weird, right? But in high school, suddenly all these other people around me started looking at him and saying, well, he's kind of weird. And slowly, Jeff and I stopped hanging around with Dave. And by the time grade 12 hit, we hadn't been with Dave for a long time. And we had a different set of friends. And sometimes we do that with God, don't we? We just kind of edge him out. Yeah, we save him for Sundays, but he's not really there Monday to Friday. And we edge him out. And friends, if we want to be like Daniel, if we want to be a hero in our own story, we need to make the choice to lean into relationship in the good and in the bad. Let's look at the rest of the choices that Daniel made. So Daniel has come up with this idea to eat only vegetables and water, and he's gotten approval from the attendant that he will only eat that. Verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided before the others. Now here's the thing. Don't think it's the diet. Okay? This is not teaching. Daniel 1 is not the proof that all of us should become vegans, okay? No, not going to happen. Not in my house anyways. My daughter's trying, but I'm not going to let it happen. Just saying. Daniel 1 will not support your case, Emma. Just that's the way it is. Nothing wrong with being vegetarian. Just give me some meat with it, okay? It's not about the diet, okay? It's about the relationship. It's about the relationship that Daniel leans into. Daniel does not become healthier than everybody else because of what he's eating. It probably helped, but it's God that makes the difference. Let's keep reading. God gave these 4 young men, and this is the proof text here in the next statement, that it's not the vegetables, that it's God that's doing it. God gave these 4 men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meaning of visions and dreams. Daniel leans into relationship, and God makes the difference. It's interesting here in Daniel, it starts out right here in this first chapter, and there's a juxtaposition that is made between wisdom of God and wisdom of man. And it starts here in chapter 1, and it continues through the whole book. That Daniel is repeatedly pitted against the wisdom of Babylon. That Daniel and the wisdom that God gives him always is greater than the wisdom of Babylon. See, Daniel's enrolled into a school where he is given all of the wisdom of Babylon, but it's not that sets him apart. It's not the diet that sets him apart. It's the fact that he leans into relationship with God and he listens to God. So not only do we need to say, yeah, I'm in relationship with God, but we need to listen to him. Because as we listen to him, he begins to give us a different perspective. And this, again, is what Daniel's whole life is about. This is why the book of Daniel was written. The book of Daniel was written to people who were returning to Jerusalem. So they had lived through the exile, or they were continuing to be in exile, okay? But they were allowed to return, and they chose to stay in a foreign land. And this book of Daniel is written to people who are returning to this promised land, to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was nothing. And Larry's going to speak about what Jerusalem was like next week as he looks at Nehemiah. Jerusalem was destroyed, and they're returning, and Daniel's written for them. Why? To give them hope, to give them a different perspective on what's going on in the world. And the overarching theme is that the Most High God is sovereign over all things. In other words, God is in control. And that even though Jerusalem is destroyed, God is in control. Even though you're living in exile, though you have people saying your God is dead, that your God is nothing, that God is still in control. And Daniel chose to listen to God throughout all of the things that happened in his life, to see things from God's perspective. And you and I, we need to see from God's perspective as well. We need to see that what's going on in our life, that maybe God has a plan for this, that maybe there's something he wants us to work on. We need to listen to God. And the problem is that sometimes we're too busy listening to everybody else that we don't listen to God. It's kind of like selfie sticks. Do you guys know what selfie sticks are? I tried to buy one this morning at Walmart, and the guy looked at me like I didn't know what I was talking about. So I didn't get one, but I got a picture of a selfie stick. It's a stick that you put out, and you put your phone on the end, and you take a picture of you, okay? And you have people all around the world in front of beautiful things that God has created. This is the Grand Canyon. And what are they focused on? Themselves. The Bible declares that all of creation declares God's glory to all of us, and we're busy with selfie sticks looking at how beautiful we are instead of seeing God in all of glory. And the selfie stick is just a symptom that we don't listen enough to God, because God has a perspective on our situation and what we've gone through, and he wants to refine us and to make us into the person we were created to be. He created us to have life in the fullest. And if we will listen to him like Daniel did, then we will experience that as well. And God gave Daniel great wisdom, the ability to interpret dreams. And again, he's put up against the smartest minds of Babylon. And because he listens, and Daniel even declares that later in his life, he says, I can't interpret your dreams, but God can. And because he listens to God, he's able to make these wise choices. Let's keep reading. There's one more choice that Daniel makes. If you want to make tomorrow a better day because your choices today determine your tomorrow, if you want to change tomorrow, make choices today to listen to God, to lean into relationship. Verse 18, when the training period ordered by the king was complete, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel and his friends. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. When Daniel finishes everything, he's brought before the king, and the king is incredibly impressed. Now remember, this training program was 3 years long. 3 years. I used to be the youth pastor here at this church, and you know what? I don't know any of the teens in our church that would refuse food, okay? If I put all of this food here before our teenagers this morning, I guarantee you it would be gone. Maybe not the Brussels sprouts, okay? But I think everybody else would eat everything. Right, Matthew? Right, Liam? Yeah, they're laughing. They know. Especially guys, right? Daniel's a guy. He's a teenage boy. Daniel, Thomas, you guys wouldn't turn down this food, would you? No, you wouldn't. Yet Daniel and his friends, for 3 years, choose to eat vegetables and water. Carrots, yuck. Brussels sprouts, yuck. But for 3 years they do it. Daniel chose not to compromise in what he believed. Every day he was presented with the facts that Babylon is better than Jerusalem. Every day he was probably reminded that Nebuchadnezzar took your God's sacred things from the temple and put them in his temple. So your God is nothing. And Daniel leaned in, and Daniel listened. He saw things from God's perspective, and he refused to compromise. And the Daniel that you and I know and love, okay, the Daniel in the lion's den that everybody can probably tell the story of today, that didn't happen overnight. He wasn't born that way. That Daniel first had to go through 3 years of vegetables and water. And it probably continued beyond that 3 years of eating certain foods and not eating other foods. And he refused every day with something as simple as food, not to compromise his faith, not to compromise his life. But he chose to honor God with all that he did, even the food that he ate. And the challenge is that sometimes in life we lean into relationship with God. We hear what he has to say, but then as we're going about our day, we make compromises. Well, I don't really need, I'll do that next time. Oh, I don't really need to do that today. Oh, I think that was contextual and that doesn't really apply to me today. And we compromise on decisions. And we don't do what God has actually spoken to us about. And eventually, as we compromise daily, there's nothing left to compromise in the end. Because we've given everything up. It's kind of like this. In California, there's a park called Redwood National Park. And maybe you've been there. They have these huge redwood trees that grow for hundreds of years. And a number of years ago, one of these trees fell over without warning, and nobody knew why. There wasn't an earthquake that took it down. There wasn't a storm that blew it over. Nobody cut it down. But the investigators, when they went in to go and see what was going on, found out that inside, some beetles had gotten inside the trunk and had eaten at the fibers that give it its strength until there was nothing left inside. It was rotten from the inside out, and it fell to the ground. And when we compromise, that's what happens with us. But every time you choose not to compromise, and this is the third choice that Daniel did, he chose not to compromise. And every time you choose not to compromise, you make an investment in you. You make an investment in tomorrow. But too often, we're more concerned with instant gratification than tomorrow. And Daniel teaches us that we need to choose not to compromise. And what that means, because hear this correctly, okay? Because sometimes we think compromising and not compromising, that if I'm not going to compromise, that I need to make sure that I tell everybody what they should and shouldn't be doing, because I'm not going to compromise my beliefs, so you should eat this. Daniel did not go out and tell the attendant, hey, you should only eat vegetables too. He said no. He said, let me eat vegetables for these 10 days. Let me do this. You see, when I say don't compromise, what I'm saying is what God says to you, what God speaks to you through his word, do not compromise this. The rest of the world is going to do what they're going to do, okay? That's what happened in Daniel's day. But you don't compromise. Daniel was not shy to share what he believed, though, when asked. Daniel was not shy to give glory to God in the midst of this. And you be that way too. But don't lead by saying, don't eat anything but vegetables. Instead, lead by just saying, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to hold fast to this, and you can do what you're going to do. And when they ask you, as they question why you do some things, let the glory of God shine through you in all that you do. But you don't compromise. We get a bad name because we always lead with the do's and don'ts. Instead, just do those things yourself first. And let the Nebuchadnezzars, the Ashpenaz, and whoever else do what they're going to do, and you honor God with all that you do. These are the choices that Daniel made. He chose to lean in when everybody else said, your God is dead. He chose to listen to God. Even when everyone around him said, there's a better way. And he chose not to compromise in himself. And slowly, if you read the rest of the book of Daniel, slowly something incredible happens. The nation of Babylon is changed. You find Nebuchadnezzar years later writing an open letter to everybody in the kingdom. And what's he saying? He's saying that the Most High God is sovereign over all. This Nebuchadnezzar who desecrates the temple and steals these things because of Daniel's life, because Daniel wouldn't compromise. He changes this king so that the king says that Yahweh is the God of all gods. I mean, this is amazing. Even if you look at the progression, in chapter 1, what we see is Daniel is given a different name, Belteshazzar, and they start calling him that. But by the end of the book, even the king who wanted him to be called Belteshazzar after his own God, even the king is calling him Daniel. And they refer to him as the captive of Judah. Daniel served, verse 21 says this, he served until Cyrus was king. 67 years he serves the empire. And he's still referred to as the captive from Judah. Why? Because he hasn't given up his identity. He hasn't compromised in the day-to-day things. And the people recognize this and they honor him and thereby honor God. By calling him Daniel, by referring to him by his Judean identity. This is an amazing thing, and it all starts through 3 choices as a teenager. Imagine what would happen if you and I made those choices today. Imagine if we did this tomorrow and the day after and the day after. I mean, what would it do in Canada? What would it do in this world? It would be incredible. So what do we take away from this? Well, what choice do you need to make today? There's 3 choices I give you. Maybe you just pick one of those choices to start with. There's an old saying that the journey of 1,000 footsteps begins with just one. Maybe you need to just take one choice and do it. Maybe today, maybe you've been kicking the tires of faith for some time and it's time for you to actually say, I want to have a relationship with God. I'd love to help you do that. Come and talk with me after the service. Or maybe you've been leaning out. Maybe it's time to start leaning into God. Choose one action this week that could be evidence, maybe only to yourself or maybe to the people around you, evidence that you are leaning into relationship. It could be something as simple as the food you eat, like Daniel did. Or maybe you need to listen to God today and get his perspective on what's happened in your life or what's happening. Maybe you need to spend more time reading his word. We put a weekly reading schedule in the Bible every week for this because we believe that God wants to talk to you. Are you listening? Or maybe you need to choose not to compromise. Maybe there's something that you've been compromising every single day and you know what it is. And the Spirit's been whispering to you this morning about that. What if you choose today that one thing, you just aren't going to compromise anymore on that? And it's going to be hard and it's going to take a while. But what if you chose to do it? Daniel